Good evening, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes before we get started, just to let if there's any people still coming into the meeting. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for attending the virtual public workshop for the Capacity Enhancement Project's Environmental Assessment at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. My name is Sarah Potter and I am the project manager for Laderman Brown, and we are the consultant that is assisting the City of Charlotte in preparing the environmental assessment. The draft EA was published on April 16th and is now available on the project website. Comments on the draft will be accepted through June 1st of this year, and information on where to submit comments is provided at the end of this presentation and also on the project website. This presentation this evening was the same presentation that was given yesterday afternoon. There will be no new information given today that wasn't given yesterday. So the City of Charlotte is hosting this workshop to summarize the findings in the draft EA. The virtual workshop is going to start with a presentation. It's going to be followed by a question and answer session where Jack Christine and myself, Jack is the Charlotte COO, and we will both be available to answer questions at the end of the meeting. Attendees' audio and webcam are disabled, so if you want to submit a question, you need to use the Q&A feature that's located at the bottom of your screen. You can take your mouse and hover it over the bottom of your screen and you should see a Q&A button appear. If you have a specific question regarding a specific slide that we discuss, I just ask that you reference that in your question so that we can answer the question as best as possible. If there are any media inquiries, we ask that you email media@cltairport.com to follow up on those inquiries. Comments and questions submitted during this presentation are not included in the official record of comments, so we strongly encourage everyone to submit all the questions that are asked and any additional comments you have via email or via U.S. Postal Service or at the public hearing that is following this workshop. All comments included in the email or the U.S. Postal Service or at the hearing will be included in the official record for the EA. Lastly, I just want to let everyone know this is being recorded and this recording will be posted to the project website following the meeting. Okay, the agenda for the presentation we'll review the roles in preparing the EA. We'll provide an overview of the EA process, review the purpose and need and alternatives. Then we'll present the potential environmental impacts and end with the Q&A session and discuss how to submit a written comment. So the roles on the EA is the FAA is the lead federal agency, and they are responsible for the ultimate compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or what we call NEPA, and also the scope and content of the EA. FAA, following the issuance of the final EA, will issue a federal decision on the project. The City of Charlotte is the airport sponsor, and they are responsible for preparing the EA for the FAA in accordance with NEPA and other regulations. The city is also leading all the public outreach for the EA. Landerman Brown is the consultant firm which I work for, and we are working under the direction of the City of Charlotte, and we're assisting with the preparation of the EA and the direction of any sub-consultants we have on our team. So the purpose of an EA is to analyze and document potential environmental effects from the proposed action or alternatives, and to develop any mitigation measures that may be needed due to impacts. So this slide shows the EA process, which started with the conversion from the EIS to the EA. It then led into the confirmation of the purpose and need and development of alternatives. We then described the affected environment, and then led into the environmental impacts that were analyzed for each of the alternatives we were looking at. The draft EA was published on April 16th, as I mentioned, and we are now in the public review and comment period, which is 45 days long. Yesterday and today, we held virtual public workshops and a hearing, which gives the opportunity for the public to submit oral comments on the draft EA document. At the end of the 45-day comment period, all of the comments will be reviewed, and we will respond to them in the final EA document. Following the publishing of the final EA, FAA will issue their federal decision. So moving on to the purpose and need for the project. There are two needs that Charlotte is addressing with this project. The first is insufficient gate capacity and ramp congestion. A gating analysis was completed based on FAA approved forecasts, and you'll see the results in the table on the screen. If no additional gates, a total of 140 gates would be needed by 2028, and 150 would be needed in 2033. If no additional gates were constructed in the future, aircraft would have to hold on the airfield after landing to wait for an available gate. Having aircraft hold on the airfield results in increased congestion in the future on the pavement surrounding the terminal. In excessive wait times during peak arrival times, it greatly affects the airline's schedule and integrity, which ultimately means that passengers could miss connections. Complicating the gate shortage is also the ramp movement area, which is the pavement surrounding the terminal complex. There are 5 concourses, A, B, C, D, and E, which you can see on the map on the screen. And each of those provide a combination of single taxi lanes, which is the red line on the diagram. And then also they provide dual taxi lanes, which are the green lines on the diagram. And dual taxi lanes, you can think of like normal roadways. Dual parallel taxi lanes, they also provide the aircraft to operate in opposite directions, whereas single taxi lanes only have one bidirectional flow, so only one aircraft can be using the taxi lane at any time. This results in major ramp congestion, especially in the areas of concourses D and E. These two concourses together have 55 gates, or approximately half of the gate capacity at the airport, which leads to high traffic volumes on this single taxi lane. And additionally, Concourse E is also the regional jet concourse, and as a result, aircraft have more turns per gate each day, which increases the congestion in that area also. The second need for the project is addressing insufficient runway capacity to meet future demand at acceptable levels of delay. An acceptable level of delay for this project is defined as an all-weather average of 7 minutes of runway delay per operation. Airfield simulations were prepared to understand the level of runway delays that Charlotte is currently experiencing. This simulation showed the throughput, which is the number of aircraft operations that can be processed by the runways, increases by 13% from 2016 to 2028. whereas the all-weather average delays increases by 21%. These changes in throughput and delay demonstrate that the runway system has the ability to achieve greater capacity beyond 2016, but it does so at rapidly increasing delays. So as a result, it's reasonable to conclude that the Charlotte runway system was approaching capacity near 2016. Between 2028 and 2033, the throughput increase slows to 4%, but the delays would continue to increase at a rapid pace of 24%. That relationship of throughput and delay indicates that the runway system would reach capacity around 2028. So the airport developed a set of project elements to address the needs that I just previously described. These elements are collectively referred to as the proposed action. The proposed action in this EA includes a new 10,000-foot runway, which is shown in purple in the diagram, as well as north and south end-around taxiways. In addition, West Boulevard would also need to be relocated, and this would be done so using existing roadways Byram and Piney Top. The other main elements include expanding concourses B and C, creating dual taxi lanes around the terminal, closing runway 523, and expanding the ramp area south so that there are east-west corridors to allow for efficient movement of aircraft. The Council on Environmental Quality requires that an EA explore and consider all reasonable and feasible alternatives to the proposed action that meet the purpose and need, but do so with a lesser environmental impact. As a result, a thorough and objective analysis of alternatives was completed as part of the EA process. The virtual presentation posted on December 3rd of last year presented the alternatives analysis. This was presented on our project website. The analysis identified 3 what we call build alternatives that were analyzed in the EA for potential environmental impacts. The no action alternative is also required to be carried forward in the EA by the Council on Environmental Quality, even though it does not meet the purpose and need for the project. The no action is used as a basis of comparison for all of the build alternatives to compare back to in order to understand the level of impacts for each alternative. In the no action alternative for this EA, airport infrastructure would remain the same as today, except with additional independent improvement projects that are currently either under design or in construction. These projects are circled in orange on the screen, and they have each undergone their own independent NEPA documentation and approval process. These include the Concourse A Phase 2 pier and ramp expansion, the north end-around taxiway on the center runway, the west hold pads, a de-ice pad on the mid-south field, or this mid-south airfield there, and then also a cross-field taxiway. In the no action scenario, it's very important to understand operations will still continue to increase at the airport, but they would do so and experience an increase in delay per operation, and they would also have continued congestion in the terminal area and a shortage of gates. All right, so the alternatives, the build alternatives that we looked at, the first one is the proposed action, which I previously described, and it includes a new runway in the midfield with north and south end-around taxiways. This runway would be located 3,100 feet to the east of the west runway and 1,200 feet to the west of the center runway. This alternative also includes expansion of concourses B and C, dual taxi lanes, crossfield taxiway corridors, and also closing 523. The new runway in this alternative is assumed to primarily be used by departures, and that is why it is 10,000 feet long. So our assumptions are in this alternative are that arrivals would primarily use the west runway, the existing center runway, and the east runway. And it's assumed that departures would primarily occur on the new runway and also the east runway. Alternative 2 is very similar to alternative 1. In this alternative, the new runway is located 3,200 feet to the east of the west runway and 1,100 feet to the west of the center runway. So there's a 100-foot eastward shift of the runway, and this is meant to take advantage of potential future runway separation rules by the FAA that could potentially lead to different uses of the runway. This new runway, again, similar to alternative 1, was assumed to primarily be used by departures, therefore it's 10,000 feet long. So in this alternative, the runway use is the same as alternative 1, which is arrivals would primarily use the west, existing center, and east runway, and departures would primarily use the new runway and the east runway. All right, the third build alternative that we looked at includes a new midfield runway located 3,400 feet to the east of the west runway and 900 feet to the west of the center runway. This new runway is only 8,900 feet long, as it's assumed to be primarily used by arrivals, and therefore 10,000 feet is not required. So the runway use in this alternative would be assumed to be on the west runway, the new runway, and the east runway, and departures would use the existing center runway and the east runway. So each of the alternatives were then evaluated for their potential impact on 18 resource categories, which you see identified on this slide. The next section of this presentation will review the potential environmental impacts at a high level for each of the resource categories you see in bold. These include DOT Section 4F, historic, archaeological, and cultural resources, noise and noise compatible land use, and water resources, which includes wetlands, floodplains, surface water, and groundwater. Wild and scenic rivers are also included there, but there are none in the area. You can find the potential impacts for all the remaining resource categories in the EA, and also even more detail on the bolded categories in the draft EA. So first, we're going to start with historic, architectural, archaeological, and cultural resources. The National Historic Preservation Act is the primary law governing the preservation of historic and prehistoric resources. Section 106 of that act requires FAA to determine the potential effects of undertakings, or what we call the proposed action. The study area used in historic resources is called the area of potential effect, and you see it shown on the diagram in purple. This boundary is identified to include any areas that would physically be impacted by the project, but it also includes areas where noise increases could occur or visual impacts could occur. Within that area, 2 historic resources were identified, and they include the WPA Douglas Airport hangar, which is identified as number 1 in the northeast part of the airfield. And then there's the old terminal building, which is identified as the number 2, and it's on the east midfield area. Both of these properties are determined to be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So that is why they are actually determined, the impact analysis looked at each of these properties. So the impact analysis completed determined that the WPA Douglas Airport hangar would not experience a direct or indirect effect with any of the 3 alternatives that we looked at. However, the old terminal building was determined to have a direct adverse effect, as it would be removed with the implementation of all 3 build alternatives. As a result, the FAA, the North Carolina Historic Preservation Office, and the City of Charlotte will enter into a memorandum of agreement, and that will address the impact and mitigate the adverse effect. Okay, the next category is the U.S. Department of Transportation Section 4F resources. And these are resources which are publicly protected. They include publicly owned parks, recreation areas, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, historic sites of national, local, or state significance. So again, we're looking at the 2 historic sites that were identified in the previous analysis for historic. Both of those are considered Section 4F properties. There were no other 4F properties which were identified within the boundary of the study area. The study area in this resource category was the same as historic. It includes areas where disturbance would occur and visual impacts or potential noise increases could occur. And when you look at Section 4F impacts, there are two types of impacts that you analyze. The first is a physical use, and the second is a constructive use. A physical use would occur when the action actually involves the physical taking of the property, and a constructive use would occur if the impacts of the property are so severe that it would substantially, impair the reason why it was considered a Section 4F property. So implementation of all of the alternatives was determined to have a physical use on the old terminal building as it would be physically removed. The WPA Douglas Airport hangar was determined to not have any physical or constructive use with any of the alternatives. So as previously mentioned, the FAA, North Carolina Historic Preservation Office, and the City of Charlotte are entering into a memorandum of agreement to mitigate the impact. All right, the next category we're going to discuss is noise and noise compatible land use. So before we actually get into the contours, I want to make sure everyone's aware significant impact is defined by FAA is if the action or the alternative would increase noise by a 1.5 decibel or more with over a noise sensitive land use within the 65 DNL or higher noise contour. So for example, if an increase from 65.5 to 67 DNL occurred over a noise sensitive land use, then there would be a significant impact. A noise sensitive facility located in the 65 DNL is not necessarily considered a significant impact unless it is in a 1.5 dB increase area. And also the FAA requires that all of this analysis for noise impacts we use a particular noise model that they require. It's called AEDT. And they require us to use that model and also to prepare noise contours. You are not allowed to use noise measurements to determine impacts. So getting on to the exhibit on the screen, this is the alternative one, proposed action versus the no action noise contour. The black hatched line contour is the no action 65 DNL contour, and the blue line is the alternative 65 DNL contour. The area shown in the green hatched is the 1.5 dB increase area, and that's where significant impacts could potentially occur. However, that area is entirely located over compatible land use, which is airport property, and some of it slightly goes on to the Norfolk Southern property. And as a result, there would be no significant impacts with alternative one and no mitigation would be required. Looking at the number of noise sensitive facilities in the alternative 65 DNL, you see 21 less residential units, you see one less school, one more church, and one more daycare facility in the alternative 65 DNL. All right, alternative 2 contour looks very similar to alternative 1 as the runways are in only 100 feet different. So this slide has the same color scheme, which is the no action is in the black hatched, and the alternative 65 DNL is in the blue line. As you can see, the green hatched 1.5 dB increase area is entirely over airport property and the Norfolk Southern area. So there are no significant impacts with this alternative either, and no mitigation would be required. There would be 17 less residential units, one less school, one more church, and one more daycare facility exposed to the 65 DNL noise contour for alternative 2. All right, alternative 3, if you remember, this runway is used differently, so it's used by arrivals. And so you'll see a little bit different impact areas. And again, The no action is in the black hatched area, and the blue line is the alternative 3 noise contour. The green again is the 1.5 dB increase area. And as you can see, that area extends south over residential units when you compare it back to the no action contour. And as a result, this alternative would experience significant noise impacts. This alternative would also have an increase of 4 residential units, 1 less school, 1 more church, and 1 more daycare facility exposed to the 65 DNL contour. All right, this next slide is a zoom in of that southern area where the 1.5 extends. Within that 1.5 dB area, there would be 20 housing units or approximately 50 people. Of the 20 residential units, 16 have previously been sound insulated, and the remaining 4 have been offered, however, have declined under previous mitigation programs at the airport. All right, the last category is water resources. This category again includes wetlands, floodplains, surface water, and groundwater resources. The study area identified for water includes all areas where physical impacts could occur from the project. And you can see it on the screen in the yellow outlined area. The construction of all 3 alternatives would result in the permanent impact of 5 acres of wetlands, 8,150 linear feet of streams. Impacts to the wetlands and streams would require an individual permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, and mitigation would be achieved through the purchase of stream and wetland credits from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services Umbrella Stream and Wetland Mitigation Bank. In addition, 13 acres of 100-year floodplains would be impacted, which would require coordination with FEMA and remapping of the floodplains. This area is on the southern portion of the airport, and it's in the rusty colored shaded area. There's also 211 acres of new impervious surface, which is new pavement. And this increase in impervious surfaces would be accommodated by the airport stormwater system, and no additional improvements would be required. Abandonment of 2 wells, which are located in the midfield south of the Concourse B area, would also need to be abandoned, and that would be done so in accordance with federal, state, or local requirements. So in summary, alternative 1, which is the airport's proposed action, and alternative 2 would have no significant impacts on any of the environmental resource categories. Alternative 3 would have significant impacts on noise and noise compatible land use. And then lastly, this ends the summary of the impact analysis that we prepared. But we just want to acknowledge that COVID's potential impact on the project. The full impact of COVID-19 within the national aviation system is not known at this time. However, the industry has recovered despite every other major worldwide incident, pandemic, or recession, which underlines the demand for air transportation. At this time, we're seeing Charlotte returning to 100% of what they were operating at in 2019. So they are recovering fairly quickly compared to others across the country. And they're going to continue to monitor actual traffic and delays in addition to the short-term forecast to make sure the appropriate timing of the EA projects is taken. So with that, we are ending this presentation. If you would like to submit a question, please do so under the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. However, we do, as I mentioned, strongly encourage you to submit a formal written comment on the draft EA and any information. Please submit your comments either by email to cltcapacityea@landrum-brown.com, or you can mail via the U.S. Postal Service to Sarah Potter at 4445 Lake Forest Drive, Cincinnati, Ohio 45242. All comments must be submitted by June 1st of 2021 to be included in the official record for this EA. The final EA will, as I mentioned, include the comments and responses to them. Following the issuance of the final EA, then FAA issues their federal decision on the project. So with that, let me go to the questions and see if there are any questions. At this time, I do not see that anybody has entered any questions. So please do so if you have any. We'll give you a minute or two to go ahead and do so. We are standing by. All right, well, I guess at this point, we'll go ahead and take an intermission. If anybody does think of a question within the next half an hour before the public hearing begins, you can enter it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But in any case, we will be back at 7 p.m. to begin the official public hearing to accept oral comments. I just want everyone to know that is not a question and answer session. That is truly just allowing you, the public, to provide your comments orally on the draft EA. So if nobody has any questions, we will see you back at 7 p.m. Thank you.